People never reveal your true value when life is easy. They reveal it when they believe you have no one left to stand beside you. I learned that lesson beneath crystal chandeliers, surrounded by people wearing perfect smiles that disappeared the moment they looked at me. The ballroom shimmered with gold light, fresh white roses lined every aisle, and a string quartet played softly enough to make the evening feel like something from a movie. My cousin Olivia had always dreamed of a wedding like this. 500 guests, a luxury hotel overlooking Central Park, champagne that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Everything sparkled except the people I called family. I adjusted the simple navy dress I had worn 3 years earlier to a nursing school graduation because it was still the nicest thing I owned. After paying my father's medical bills and helping my younger brother finish college, buying another dress had never felt important. I smiled anyway. I truly wanted Olivia to have a beautiful day. My wedding gift rested carefully in my hands. It was not expensive, just a handcrafted wooden keepsake box made by a local artisan, filled with handwritten family recipes copied from my late grandmother's notebook. I thought it would mean something. I was wrong. Well, look who finally decided to show up. My aunt's voice floated across the reception hall before I even reached the gift table. Several nearby guests turned toward me. Her smile never reached her eyes. I was beginning to think your second job mattered more than family. A few people laughed politely. I forced a small smile. My hospital shift ended later than expected. She glanced slowly over my dress before looking at the gift in my hands. That explains the outfit. More laughter. Someone whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Maybe weddings have a casual dress code now. Heat rushed into my face, but I kept walking. Years of working 12-hour nursing shifts had taught me how to swallow embarrassment without letting it show. I carefully placed my gift beside dozens of designer boxes wrapped in satin ribbons. Before I could step away, another relative lifted it from the table with exaggerated curiosity. "What did Hannah bring?" she asked loudly. Without waiting for permission, she opened the lid. Silence lasted barely a second before disappointment spread across her face. "Recipes?" she said. "That is thoughtful." Her tone carried just enough mock sympathy to invite another wave of laughter. Someone near the back quietly muttered, "She probably could not afford anything else." My hands tightened together until my fingertips turned white. I wanted to explain. I wanted to tell them that my grandmother's recipes had once held our family together when money was scarce. That every page carried memories no luxury blender or expensive crystal vase could replace. Instead, I stayed silent. Olivia noticed the commotion from across the ballroom but quickly looked away when our eyes met. That hurt more than every joke combined. A wedding coordinator approached me with an uncomfortable smile. "Miss Brooks," she said softly, "there seems to be a seating adjustment. We no longer have space at the family tables." I looked toward the reception floor where several chairs remained obviously empty. She lowered her voice even further. "Would you mind sitting near the service entrance?" Before I could answer, the grand ballroom doors slowly opened. The cheerful conversations faded one by one. The orchestra stopped playing in the middle of a song. Hundreds of heads turned toward the entrance at exactly the same time. Whoever had just arrived had not merely entered the wedding. Somehow, without saying a single word, they had completely changed the atmosphere of the room. Every conversation inside the ballroom faded into an uneasy silence. Even the waitstaff stopped moving for a moment, balancing silver trays as every pair of eyes drifted toward the entrance. I turned with everyone else, expecting another wealthy guest or perhaps a famous politician arriving fashionably late. Instead, a tall man stepped through the open doors wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that seemed almost understated compared to the luxury surrounding him. He did not smile. He did not wave. He simply walked forward with quiet confidence while several men in dark suits remained a respectful distance behind him. No one announced his name. They did not need to. The sudden stillness around the room said enough. I recognized him immediately from newspaper headlines and business magazines left behind in hospital waiting rooms. Lucas Bennett. Depending on who was telling the story, He was either one of the city's most influential investors or the man powerful people avoided disappointing. Until that moment, he had existed only as someone far removed from my ordinary life. I lowered my eyes, assuming he had come because the groom's family had important connections. People like him attended events where fortunes were discussed over dinner. They certainly did not notice nurses wearing old dresses. The bride's father hurried across the ballroom with a practiced smile. Several business leaders followed, eager to greet the unexpected guest. Cameras appeared almost instantly as guests quietly lifted their phones beneath the tables. Lucas acknowledged each greeting with a polite nod but never slowed his pace. His attention seemed fixed on something farther inside the ballroom. I stepped aside to avoid blocking anyone's view and quietly picked up the wooden keepsake box that still rested awkwardly in my hands after my relatives had finished laughing at it. I only wanted to disappear before anyone found another reason to embarrass me. The wedding coordinator approached again with visible discomfort. "Miss Brooks, if you could follow me now, I can show you your new table." I nodded without arguing. There was no point anymore. I had already accepted that sometimes remaining quiet hurt less than defending yourself before people who had already decided your worth. I followed her toward the back of the ballroom where a small table sat beside the service doors. It was separated from the celebration by decorative flower arrangements, almost hidden from the dance floor. 2 empty chairs waited beside stacks of folded linens meant for the catering staff. The coordinator looked genuinely apologetic. "I know this is not ideal." I managed a small smile. "It is fine." It was not fine, but dignity sometimes meant refusing to let other people watch you break. I had just reached for the chair when I noticed something unusual. The conversations around the ballroom had stopped again. Not because someone had made another speech, because Lucas Bennett had changed direction. Instead of walking toward the bride, the groom, or the family welcoming committee, he continued across the ballroom in a straight line. His polished shoes echoed softly against the marble floor. Every step brought him closer to the quiet corner where I stood. I looked behind me to see whether someone important had entered through the service hallway. No one was there. When I turned back, he had already stopped only a few feet away. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. The room remained completely silent. Then, with hundreds of curious eyes fixed upon us, Lucas looked directly at me. His expression calm but unmistakably concerned, and asked one simple question that no one else had bothered to ask all evening. "Miss, are you all right?" For a moment, I forgot where I was. The music, the laughter, the expensive decorations, everything disappeared behind one unexpected question. No one had asked whether I was all right. They had asked why I was late, why my dress looked simple, why my gift was inexpensive, why I could not be more like everyone else. But no one had asked how I felt. I looked at Lucas, searching his face for mockery that never appeared. His expression remained calm, patient, almost strangely sincere. I forced a polite smile because that was what years of hospital work had taught me to do. "I am fine," I answered quietly. He studied me for another second before glancing toward the empty table beside the service entrance. Then his eyes shifted to the wooden keepsake box still resting in my hands. "Is that your gift?" he asked. I nodded. Before I could explain, one of my relatives laughed from across the ballroom. "It is the famous recipe box," she called loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Apparently handwritten recipes count as luxury gifts these days. Several uncomfortable chuckles followed. Lucas did not react immediately. Instead, he walked one step closer and held out his hand. "May I see it?" I hesitated before carefully placing the box into his hands. He opened it slowly, lifting the handwritten recipe cards one at a time. The paper had yellowed with age, each page covered in my grandmother's careful handwriting and tiny notes written in the margins. One card still carried a faint coffee stain from years ago. Lucas smiled almost imperceptibly as he turned another page. "These are originals," he said softly. I nodded. She taught every grandchild how to cook from them. My aunt folded her arms impatiently. "They are just old recipes." Lucas closed the lid with remarkable care before looking toward the family gathered nearby. "No, he replied evenly. They are memories that cannot be replaced. The ballroom fell silent again. His voice never became louder, yet somehow every word reached the far corners of the room. He returned the keepsake box to me with both hands, treating it as though it belonged in a museum instead of a wedding gift table. "Thank you for sharing something so personal," he said. I felt my throat tighten unexpectedly. I had prepared myself for another insult, not respect. Around us, guests exchanged uncertain glances. The bride's father quickly stepped forward wearing an uneasy smile. "Mr. Bennett, perhaps we should continue to the head table." Lucas politely acknowledged him without moving. In a moment, he looked back at me. "You work in healthcare, do you not?" I blinked in surprise. "Yes, I am a registered nurse. Long shifts, usually 12 hours. He gave a thoughtful nod, almost as though the answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "Then I imagine you have spent more nights helping strangers than most people in this room realize." No one laughed this time. The silence felt entirely different now. It was no longer filled with amusement, carried something closer to reflection. I noticed several guests quietly lowering their eyes while others looked toward the gift table where expensive boxes suddenly seemed less impressive than they had a few minutes earlier. I still had no idea why Lucas Bennett had chosen to stand beside me instead of joining the celebration everyone expected him to attend. But as I met his steady gaze, I realized the evening had quietly begun changing direction, and whatever happened next would never allow this wedding to be remembered for flowers, music, or champagne alone. No one seemed to know whether the reception should continue or remain frozen in silence. The musicians quietly lowered their instruments, and even the servers carrying silver trays hesitated before taking another step. Every conversation in the ballroom had become a whisper. Lucas Bennett still stood beside me as though the hundreds of curious eyes watching us no longer existed. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips. "How did you know I am a nurse?" I finally asked. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I notice hands," he replied calmly. I looked down without thinking. My fingers carried faint impressions left by disposable medical gloves after another 12-hour shift. A small healing scratch rested near my thumb from opening medication packaging earlier that week. Tiny details I had stopped noticing years ago. People who spend their lives helping others often forget they wear their work everywhere they go, Lucas said quietly. I did not know how to answer that. Across the ballroom, my aunt cleared her throat loudly before walking toward us with the determined smile she always wore when trying to regain control of a situation. "Mr. Bennett," she said warmly, "I am sure there has been some misunderstanding. Hannah has always been sentimental. She means well." Lucas turned politely toward her. "There is nothing wrong with sentiment when it comes from sincerity." She laughed awkwardly. "Of course, but weddings are also about presentation." Lucas looked around the beautifully decorated ballroom before returning his attention to her. "Presentation should never replace character." The words were spoken softly, yet they carried across the room with remarkable clarity. No one interrupted him. My aunt's smile slowly faded. Nearby guests who had laughed only minutes earlier suddenly found great interest in their champagne glasses. Lucas then surprised everyone again by pulling out one of the recipe cards from the keepsake box. He read the title quietly to himself before asking me, "Your grandmother wrote these?" I nodded. "Every recipe reminds me of a different holiday." His expression softened. "Then this may be the most valuable gift in the room." The bride's father attempted another polite interruption. "Mr. Bennett, perhaps the photographer could prepare for the family portraits." Lucas acknowledged him with a respectful nod. "I will join you shortly." Then he carefully returned the recipe card to its proper place, making certain every page remained perfectly aligned before closing the lid. That simple gesture somehow carried more respect than anyone in my own family had shown all evening. I felt emotion rising unexpectedly in my chest and quickly looked away before anyone noticed. Years of working in hospital rooms had taught me to remain composed while families cried around me. But kindness arriving without warning was somehow harder to withstand. Lucas seemed to understand without another word. He gently placed the keepsake box back into my hands. "Never apologize for bringing something that carries love," he said. "Those things become rarer every year." Silence settled once more, but this time it no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt reflective. Several guests quietly walked toward the gift table and looked at their own expensive presents with expressions that had noticeably changed. Olivia finally stepped away from the bridal party and looked directly at me for the first time since I had arrived. There was uncertainty in her eyes now instead of indifference. I still did not understand why Lucas Bennett had chosen this moment, this wedding or me. But standing there beneath the crystal chandeliers, I began to realize that sometimes the most powerful way to restore someone's dignity was not through grand speeches or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it was simply by treating them with the respect everyone else had forgotten to give. The reception slowly came back to life, but something fundamental had changed. The music resumed, glasses clinked together again, and conversations cautiously returned. Yet every smile seemed more restrained than before. People no longer laughed as freely because they had become painfully aware of how quickly a room could expose its own character. I remained standing beside the small table near the service entrance, still holding my grandmother's keepsake box, unsure whether I should leave or quietly disappear before drawing more attention to myself. Lucas looked toward the center of the ballroom where the newlyweds prepared for another round of photographs. "Would you walk with me?" he asked. I hesitated. "I do not want to interrupt their wedding any more than I already have." He gently shook his head. "You did not interrupt anything. You simply revealed something that was already here." Before I could answer, my uncle approached wearing the strained smile of someone trying to repair a situation he no longer controlled. "Mr. Bennett," he began carefully, "perhaps we should all move forward and enjoy the celebration." Lucas gave a polite nod. "I agree completely." Relief briefly crossed my uncle's face until Lucas calmly continued. "Before that happens, however, I believe Miss Brooks deserves the seat originally prepared for her." Silence returned once again. No accusation followed. No raised voice. Only one simple observation that no one could honestly argue against. The wedding coordinator immediately looked toward the family table, then toward the empty chairs everyone had pretended not to notice earlier. My aunt attempted a nervous laugh. It was only a misunderstanding with the seating chart. Lucas met her eyes without any sign of anger. Then misunderstandings should always be corrected. Within seconds, several guests quietly stood and rearranged chairs without being asked. No one protested. The table that had somehow been full only moments before suddenly had more than enough room. The coordinator approached me again, but this time her expression carried genuine embarrassment. "Miss Brooks," she said softly, "your place is ready." I looked toward Lucas. "You did not have to do this." He answered with the same calm certainty that had marked every word since he entered the ballroom. "No. I simply chose not to ignore what everyone else had already seen." I slowly walked toward the family table. For the first time that evening, no one made another joke about my dress, my job, or my gift. The silence surrounding me now felt entirely different. It was no longer filled with judgment. Carried reflection. As dinner continued, I noticed several relatives quietly studying the handwritten recipe cards after asking permission to see them. One elderly guest smiled warmly and told me she remembered baking one of the desserts with her own grandmother many years earlier. Conversations shifted from expensive vacations and luxury purchases to family traditions, favorite meals, and memories that money could never replace. It amazed me how quickly one sincere moment could redirect an entire room. Later that evening, while the band played a slow melody, Lucas stood near one of the tall windows overlooking Central Park. I walked over simply to thank him before leaving. He looked out across the city lights for a moment before speaking. "People often believe influence is measured by how many follow you," he said quietly. "I have learned it is better measured by whether someone who has been overlooked finally feels seen." I looked down at the keepsake box resting safely in my hands. For the first time all night, it no longer felt small compared to the glitter surrounding it. Somehow, without changing a single thing about the gift itself, he had reminded everyone in the room that its true value had never depended on its price. When the wedding finally ended, I believed the evening would become nothing more than an unforgettable memory. I returned to my apartment just after midnight, placed my grandmother's keepsake box on the kitchen table, changed into comfortable clothes, and prepared for another 12-hour shift at Mercy General the following morning. Hospitals did not pause because someone had experienced an emotional evening. Patients still needed medication. Families still needed reassurance. Life moved forward. Yet something inside me had quietly changed. For the first time in years, I had seen someone with influence choose fairness instead of convenience. 3 days later, I was helping an elderly patient practice walking after hip surgery when my supervisor called me into her office. She handed me a neatly folded letter with no return address. "Someone insisted this be delivered personally," she said. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was an invitation to attend a private meeting of the Bennett Community Foundation. I immediately assumed there had been some mistake. My supervisor smiled. "They specifically requested you." That Saturday afternoon, I arrived at the foundation headquarters wearing the same navy dress from the wedding. The modern building overlooked the Hudson River, its glass walls reflecting the bright autumn sunlight. Volunteers, nurses, teachers, and social workers filled the conference room. I quickly realized I was not the only guest. Every person there had dedicated years to serving others in quiet ways that rarely received recognition. Lucas entered several minutes later without ceremony. He greeted every volunteer individually before standing at the front of the room. "Thank you for coming," he began. "Today is not about donations. It is about listening." The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. Teachers described struggling schools. Nurses explained shortages affecting patients. Community leaders spoke about loneliness among elderly residents. Lucas asked thoughtful questions but never interrupted. He filled pages of notes himself instead of asking assistants to do it. Watching him quietly absorb every story felt strangely different from the public image people often associated with his name. As the meeting ended, volunteers slowly gathered their belongings. I prepared to leave when Lucas approached. "Miss Brooks, may I have a moment?" I nodded. Once the room emptied, he looked toward the large windows before speaking. "Do you remember a winter night almost 6 years ago?" I searched my memory but slowly shook my head. He smiled gently. "You probably would not. It was another 12-hour shift at Mercy General." My confusion deepened. Lucas continued. "My younger sister was admitted after a serious car accident. She was frightened, disoriented, and refused to speak with anyone. Most people saw another patient. You sat beside her after your shift had already ended. You stayed almost 2 hours reading from a worn paperback novel because she said your voice reminded her of home." I stared at him in complete disbelief. The memory returned only gradually. A frightened young woman. A hospital room. Snow falling outside the window. "She never told me who her family was," I whispered. Lucas nodded. "She wanted to be treated like everyone else." He looked directly into my eyes. "She never forgot your kindness. Neither did I." My throat tightened as dozens of forgotten moments from years of nursing suddenly returned. None of them had seemed extraordinary at the time. They had simply felt like part of my job. Lucas smiled with quiet gratitude. "The wedding was not the first time I noticed you, Hannah. It was simply the first time I had the opportunity to return a kindness you gave without expecting anyone to remember." After that conversation, I drove home through Manhattan without turning on the radio. The city lights reflected across my windshield like scattered memories. And for the first time in years, I questioned how many lives had quietly crossed mine without my ever realizing it. I had spent so much of my career believing small acts of kindness disappeared the moment a patient left the hospital. Lucas had just proven that they did not. They waited. They echoed. Sometimes for years. The following week, Mercy General held its annual Community Appreciation Luncheon. Nurses, volunteers, donors, and former patients filled the auditorium with conversations that sounded far more genuine than anything I had heard beneath the crystal chandeliers of that wedding. I almost declined the invitation because another double shift had left me exhausted, but my supervisor insisted. "You spend your life showing up for everyone else. she said. "Today someone wants to thank you." I smiled politely, assuming she meant the hospital administration. I could not have been more mistaken. Midway through the ceremony, the hospital director stepped onto the stage and announced a new community partnership supporting continuing education for nurses serving underserved neighborhoods. Then he invited a special guest to say a few words. Lucas Bennett walked onto the stage without dramatic music or elaborate introductions. The room immediately grew quiet, but unlike the wedding, this silence felt welcoming rather than uncertain. He thanked the medical staff for carrying burdens most people never saw. He spoke about compassion as though it were a form of leadership rather than charity. Then he paused. "Several years ago," he said calmly, "someone working in this hospital reminded my family that healing begins long before medicine does. She never asked who we were. She never expected recognition. She simply stayed because another human being needed company." My heartbeat quickened. I knew where this was going, and suddenly I wished I were invisible. Lucas continued, "We often celebrate extraordinary achievements while overlooking ordinary goodness. Today I would like to correct that." The director called my name. I remained frozen for several seconds until my coworkers gently encouraged me toward the stage with warm smiles and quiet applause. Walking across that auditorium felt completely different from crossing the wedding ballroom. This time no one looked at my dress. No one measured my worth by appearances. They applauded because they recognized years of work that had rarely been noticed. Lucas handed me a simple glass award engraved with one sentence. "Compassion remembered is compassion multiplied." He leaned closer just enough for only me to hear. "My sister asked me to thank you one more time." Emotion caught in my throat before I could answer. Looking out across the audience, I noticed several familiar faces from the wedding sitting near the back. My aunt lowered her eyes the moment our gazes met. Olivia slowly stood and began clapping before anyone around her realized what she was doing. One by one, others joined her until the entire room rose to its feet. No one had been instructed to stand. No one had been asked. They simply did. In that moment, I understood something far more valuable than public recognition. Lucas had not restored my dignity by humiliating those who had overlooked me. He had simply given the truth enough space to become impossible to ignore, and sometimes that was the most powerful form of justice of all. Life slowly settled into a rhythm that felt lighter than anything I had experienced in years. My shifts at Mercy General remained long, my apartment remained modest, and my responsibilities had not magically disappeared. Yet something inside me had changed. I no longer questioned whether quiet kindness mattered. I had seen proof that it could travel farther than I ever imagined. A month after the hospital ceremony, I received another invitation from the Bennett Community Foundation. This time it was not for a private meeting. Lucas wanted me to tour a new community health initiative his organization had funded in neighborhoods where medical services had become increasingly difficult to access. I almost declined, worried that accepting another invitation might create the wrong impression. My supervisor gently smiled when I mentioned it. "Sometimes helping more people means allowing others to help you do it." Those words stayed with me as I arrived at the newly renovated health center on a bright Saturday morning. Volunteers welcomed families through wide glass doors, while children laughed in colorful waiting areas designed to make hospitals feel less frightening. Nurses from several hospitals worked beside community organizations, offering free screenings, health education, and preventive care. It did not feel like charity. It felt like dignity. Lucas greeted every volunteer before he greeted me. Watching him listen carefully to elderly patients, thank reception staff, and remember people's names made me understand why so many employees respected him without raising their voices. During the tour, he asked more questions than he answered. What would improve this room? Are these examination tables comfortable for older patients? What supplies are always running short? He wrote every suggestion in a small notebook he carried himself. Eventually, we stepped outside onto a quiet terrace overlooking the Hudson River. Autumn leaves drifted across the walkway, while families continued arriving below. Lucas rested his hands lightly against the railing. "I have another proposal," he said. I laughed softly. Should I be nervous? He smiled for the first time that morning. Only if you dislike making a difference. He explained that the foundation planned to establish a permanent advisory council led by nurses, teachers, and social workers instead of business executives. He wanted practical experience to guide future community projects. "I would like you to join it," he said. I immediately shook my head. "There are people far more qualified than I am." Lucas looked toward the families entering the building before answering. "Perhaps academically, but not everyone understands what it means to place another person's needs ahead of recognition." I stood quietly for several moments, watching a little boy proudly hold the hand of his grandmother as volunteers welcomed them inside. Finally, I asked the only question that truly mattered. Would my voice actually matter? Lucas turned toward me with complete certainty. "It already has." I accepted because I realized the invitation had never been about status. It was about responsibility. As we walked back inside, several volunteers greeted us with warm smiles, not because of titles or influence, but because they believed we were working toward the same purpose. Looking around that bright community center filled with hope instead of judgment, I understood that the wedding had never truly been the beginning of my story. It had simply been the moment the world finally noticed the quiet path I had already been walking for years. Nearly a year passed before I returned to the same hotel where everything had changed. This time I was not carrying quiet embarrassment through the front doors. I arrived wearing the same simple confidence I had earned: one patient, one long shift, and one honest decision at a time. The Bennett Community Foundation was hosting its annual fundraising gala, inviting nurses, teachers, volunteers, community leaders, and families whose lives had been touched by the programs we had built together. The ballroom looked almost identical to the wedding reception that had once left me questioning my worth. The crystal chandeliers still reflected warm light across the polished marble floor. White roses still decorated every table. The music still floated gently through the room. Yet somehow everything felt different because I was different. Lucas welcomed every guest personally before quietly taking his place near the back of the ballroom instead of the stage. He never seemed interested in becoming the center of attention. As the evening continued, the host unexpectedly invited me to share a few words about the Community Health Initiative. I stood at the podium looking across hundreds of familiar and unfamiliar faces. For a brief moment, I remembered the frightened woman who had once stood alone beside the service entrance, holding a wooden recipe box while wondering whether anyone would ever see beyond her appearance. Then I smiled. "People often ask when my life changed." I began. "They expect me to describe a miracle, a promotion, or a fortunate opportunity. The truth is much simpler. My life changed the day someone chose to see me before judging me." The ballroom became completely silent. I learned that respect cannot be purchased, borrowed, or demanded. It is built through ordinary choices repeated every single day. A nurse staying after her shift. A teacher refusing to give up on one struggling student. A volunteer remembering someone's name. A stranger deciding that another person's dignity matters. I paused long enough to notice Lucas standing quietly near the back of the room with the same calm expression he had carried since the first evening we met. Sometimes the greatest gift we receive is not money, influence, or recognition, I continued. Sometimes it is one person willing to remind us of the value we almost forgot we possessed. When I finished speaking, the applause rose slowly before filling every corner of the ballroom. I stepped away from the podium and found Lucas waiting near one of the tall windows overlooking the city lights. Neither of us spoke immediately. There was no need. Finally, he looked toward the skyline and smiled. "You never needed someone to save you," he said quietly. I shook my head. "No, I only needed someone to remind me that kindness is never weakness." He nodded as though that answer had always been enough. We stood together watching Manhattan glow beneath the evening sky while guests continued celebrating behind us. Looking back now, people still remember that remarkable wedding because of the unexpected guest who changed the atmosphere of an entire room. I remember it for a different reason. It was the day I discovered that dignity can survive humiliation, kindness can outlive cruelty, and one quiet act of respect can echo through countless lives long after the music has ended. In the end, the most extraordinary people are rarely the loudest in the room. They are simply the ones who choose to lift another person when everyone else is looking away.